I'm Peter Jameson, staff writer for SF Weekly, and I'm here discussing problems at the SFPD Crime Lab's DNA section with Public Defender Jeff Adachi. Mr. Adachi, to start, how did you first learn about problems with DNA evidence at the crime lab?
Well, we have a long-standing history of contention with the San Francisco Crime Lab that deals specifically with DNA. From the very beginning, the crime lab was conducted in a very secretive manner. As defense attorneys, we are entitled to review logs and reports and other documents relating to DNA, and we really have had to fight for those over the years. And as early as 2 years ago, we had learned that there was a case in which the technicians' DNA, the people who were doing the testing, their DNA was found mixed with the sample of a suspect. And that's just one example of the problems that we've seen with the San Francisco DNA Crime Lab.
Mm-hmm. What concerns you about what you've learned recently about DNA evidence and its integrity at the crime lab?
Well, many people remember what happened with the crime lab and the technician, Debbie Madden. And in that instance, there were no protocols in place, and as a result, the police department was not able to take the appropriate steps when they learned that a technician was stealing drugs from the crime lab. And at the time, it was said by the police chief and others that, well, those problems have not affected the DNA crime lab. Well, we now know that that's not true. As the SF Weekly broke in a recent story, there was a case that dates back several years ago where the DNA samples were switched. And what happened is that the technician, rather than doing the test again, made a notation of this, and apparently the original record was destroyed. And the only way that we learned about this is through information that was later obtained by the agency in charge of oversight of these crime labs, and this was reported through an anonymous complaint, and they determined that yes, in fact, a switching of the samples did occur. Now, why is it significant when samples are switched? Because you have the possibility, at least, that an innocent person is going to be convicted based on evidence that is tainted. When you're talking about DNA evidence, this is powerful evidence in a criminal case. When the jury hears that so-and-so's DNA was found at the crime scene, that could make the difference, mean the difference between a conviction and an acquittal. And so when we've seen over the years a consistent pattern of malfeasance at the crime lab and steps to cover up information that should have been disclosed to defense, that's not only troubling, but it creates a complete lack of integrity within the criminal justice system.
What role did the district attorney's office play in concealing these problems, or how do you feel about how the DA's office has handled the disclosure of the types of issues you're talking about?
The district attorney's office has been very slow to respond to these problems. They've known that there's problems at the crime lab. They're in possession of evidence. There was a report recently criticizing the work that was done by a technician at the DNA crime lab, and that report wasn't turned over. So we know that there is evidence of problems relating to DNA testing that's not being provided to the defense by the prosecution. And we have to ask why. The district attorney has an obligation under law to hand over any evidence which would tend to exonerate a person accused of a crime for obvious reasons. And the San Francisco District Attorney's Office repeatedly has failed to do that. And in some cases, has waited, months or even years for independent investigation to reveal what should have been provided at the very beginning.
Now, some people might look at these problems with testing or with switches of samples and see them as technicalities that could result in dangerous criminals going free. What would your response to that type of concern be?
Well, when you talk about our criminal justice system, the integrity of evidence means everything. In other words, if you can't rely on the accuracy of DNA evidence, of evidence from a drug lab, then the entire foundation of the criminal justice system is threatened. I mean, we saw this in the situation with the scandal at the drug lab, where a technician was using drugs, was removing drugs from the crime lab, in some cases was over-reporting or under-reporting the amounts, and this caused over 600 cases to be dismissed and thousands of other cases to be called into question. We recently had another situation involving police misconduct evidence, where evidence of convictions suffered by San Francisco police officers was not provided. So all of these things really go to the heart of the criminal justice system. How can we be certain at the end of the day that the right people are being convicted and are being sent to prison if we can't rely on the integrity of evidence that's being provided by the crime lab, which is supposed to be an independent, objective agency, and it's not, because here it's run by the police department. I've consistently called for an independent crime lab. That is a crime lab that is not biased towards either side, either law enforcement or the defense. And that ultimately is the way I think San Francisco needs to go.